If you already have a strong opinion about whether it was right or wrong to drop the nuclear bombs on Japan, get ready because this video is going to blow your mind. There are voices that claim the bomb should never have been used. I cannot associate myself with such ideas. I am surprised that very worthy people adopted the position that, instead of dropping this bomb, we should have sacrificed 1 million Americans and 250,000 British lives. Supporters of the bombings generally argue that they caused the Japanese surrender, avoiding massive casualties on both sides in the planned invasion of Japan. Kyushu was to be invaded in November 1945, and Honshu 4 months later. It was thought that Japan would not surrender unless there was an overwhelming demonstration of destructive capacity. Those who oppose the bombings argue that it was militarily unnecessary, inherently immoral, a war crime, or a form of state terrorism. The end of World War II in the Pacific stands out as the most notable case of successful military coercion among modern nation-states. Japan's unconditional surrender to the United States on August 15, 1945, was a surprising result, given that Japan still possessed a formidable army of 2 million men on its home islands, fully prepared and willing to resist any American invasion, along with other forces abroad. The remarkable aspect of Japan's surrender was that the country handed over all of its national territory to an opponent that had not captured any significant part of it. That success in coercion proved to be a measure that saved lives for tens of thousands of Allied soldiers and many more Japanese. When analyzing coercion, the specific date of Japan's surrender is less important than the fact that they surrendered without offering resistance until the last moment. The crucial question to consider is why Japan chose to capitulate before facing the invasion and the decisive defeat of its main army. Let's look at 2 distinct interpretations that will guide this entire video. The conventional view, defended by Orthodox historians, predominantly echoes the American post-war perspective, holding that the bombs were the determining factor in Japan's surrender. However, another historical strand supports a different interpretation. The Soviet Union's intervention in the Pacific War on August 9, 1945, the same day as the bombing of Nagasaki, was the true catalyst for Japan's surrender and possibly made the bombs unnecessary. This approach is often called revisionist because it revisits and alters the earlier Orthodox narrative. If the Soviets had really begun the invasion mentioned, and moreover had succeeded, they would have gained a position on an island of immense strategic relevance. On July 26th, about 2 weeks before the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, the United States, Great Britain, and China issued the declaration announcing the terms of Japan's surrender, with the warning as an ultimatum. One of the main topics at stake was the ongoing war against Japan, in which the Soviet Union still remained neutral. Contrary to what it intended in its conception, which was to deprive the Japanese leadership so that the people would accept a mediated transition, the declaration made no direct mention of the Japanese emperor. However, it insisted that the authority and influence of those who misled and deceived the people of Japan into embarking on world conquest must be eliminated for all time. Allies' intentions on matters of extreme importance to the Japanese, including the extent and number of Allied occupation points, the fate of Japan's smaller islands, and how far the Allies planned to control Japan's raw materials, as well as whether Hirohito should be considered one of those who misled the people of Japan, or could potentially become part of a responsible government with a disposition to peace, were not declared, which essentially made it a blank check for the Allies. The clause of prompt and utter destruction was interpreted as a veiled warning about American possession of the atomic bomb, which had been successfully tested in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, 1 day before the opening of the conference. Although the document warned of further destruction, it mentioned nothing about the atomic bomb. At Potsdam, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin confirmed his promise made in 1943 to the British and Americans that he would join the war against Japan in exchange for Soviet influence in Manchuria and some other demands. Stalin also revealed that the Japanese had approached Moscow with informal peace proposals since 1943. In 1945, it became clear that they wanted to use neutral Soviet Union as a mediator to end the war on more favorable terms. Meanwhile, the Japanese army was preparing the country's islands for defense and blocking any serious peace effort by politicians. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Proclamation, but the USSR did not sign it. They demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. In the end, the cabinet simply ignored the ultimatum. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion occurred 600 meters above the city, causing the ground temperature to reach 4,000 degrees Celsius. Truman issued a statement after Hiroshima. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th at Potsdam was issued. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they can expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. So the bomb had been dropped, and Hiroshima destroyed. Meanwhile, Japan's leaders were discussing surrender. When the Japanese ambassador met with Molotov on August 8th to discuss peace, the Soviet diplomat handed him a declaration of war. The next day, 1.5 million Soviet troops invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing Japan's Kwantung Army. In a tense scenario, the Japanese cabinet finally held its long-awaited meeting. While debates raged, a second atomic bomb devastated Nagasaki, resulting in the tragic instant death of 40,000 people. The situation reached a critical point, leading the emperor himself to make a surprising decision. He proposed unconditional surrender, but on the condition that he maintain his position as monarch. The Japanese then transmitted these conditions to the Americans on August 10th. During the night of August 13th to 14th, 7 B-29s dropped more than 5 million leaflets over Tokyo, containing the text of the Japanese note accepting the Potsdam Declaration. This was the first indication the people had of what was happening. After this historic decision, fighting in Manchuria ceased on August 16th. The war reached its climax on September 2nd, 1945, marking the formal end of the conflict. According to historian Richard B. Frank, intercepts of messages from the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy revealed, without exception, that Japan's armed forces were determined to fight a final Armageddon battle on the homeland against an Allied invasion. The Japanese called this strategy Ketsugo, decisive operation. It was founded on the premise that American morale was fragile and could be shaken by heavy losses during the initial invasion. Military leaders in Japan also hoped that if they could resist until the beginning of the land invasion of Japan, they would be able to inflict so many casualties on the Allies that Japan could still gain some kind of negotiated settlement. Orthodox historians argued that it was to end the war more quickly and save American and Japanese lives, avoiding a bloody invasion of Japan. Since 1943, the U.S. military had been developing plans for a possible invasion of Japan. They expected the Japanese to resist fanatically. The bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945 reinforced these arguments. The invasion was scheduled to take place on November 1st, 1945. The Japanese defense plan was not to defeat the invasion, but to inflict enough losses on the Americans to obtain better peace terms. The Americans knew the Japanese were preparing and expected to face 4.5 million Japanese soldiers in Japan. U.S. planners used this information about the number of Japanese troops and the known casualty rates from Okinawa to estimate the potential losses of a full-scale invasion. By August 1945, they expected between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. In 1959, Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who led the first wave in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, met with General Paul Tibbets, who piloted the Enola Gay that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and told him, You did the right thing. You know the attitude of the Japanese at that time, how fanatical they were. They would have died for the emperor. Every man, woman, and child would have resisted that invasion with sticks and stones if necessary. The orthodox perspective asserts that casualty estimates caused U.S. leaders such as Secretary of War Henry Stimson to lose faith in an invasion. But recent research suggests that the casualty estimates were likely greatly exaggerated. The planners had no reliable methodology to use, and U.S. intelligence failed to recognize the poor quality of Japanese units. Modern estimates of possible U.S. casualties reach only about 20,000. Nevertheless, Orthodox historians claim that it was the expectations of casualties that mattered. The atomic bombs, which had proven successful in July, provided Truman with an alternative. Upon receiving news of the successful test, Truman wrote to his wife, "I'll say we'll end the war a year sooner now, and think of the kids who won't be killed." On July 21, 1945, Colonel Harry F. Cunningham, intelligence officer of the 5th Air Force, observed that the entire population of Japan is a proper military target. There are no civilians in Japan. We are making war and making it in the way that saves American lives and shortens the agony that is war. We intend to pursue and destroy the enemy wherever he is, in the greatest numbers possible, in the shortest possible time. Truman was also under public pressure to end the war quickly, with minimal losses, but at the same time not allow Japan to go unpunished. The atomic bombs seemed to meet both criteria. After the bombings, opinion polls showed that 85% of Americans supported their use, and 23% wanted more bombings. But the atomic bombs were not guaranteed to work, and for that reason, some Orthodox historians claim that Truman still wanted Soviet help. Saburo Sakai, an ace of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, stated, "If I had received the order to bomb Seattle or Los Angeles to end the war, I would not have hesitated. Therefore, I fully understand why the Americans bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima." On the other hand, revisionist historians claim that Soviet intervention became Truman's worst-case scenario. For the revisionists, the atomic bombings had more to do with containing the Soviet Union than defeating Japan. That's right, you heard that correctly. They argue that although Truman wanted Soviet help before Potsdam, he changed his mind. The revisionists highlight that Stalin never received an official invitation to join the war. Instead, they suggest that Truman wanted an insurance policy in case the bombs didn't work. Stalin provided that, confirming that Operation August Storm would begin on August 15th. Once Truman had reliable data on the bomb's successful test on July 21st, the revisionists claim he drastically changed his position to end the war before the Soviet offensive of August 15th could begin. This led the revisionists to conclude that Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw an opportunity to limit Soviet influence and prevent the USSR from obtaining the Japanese islands and the influence in northern China that had been promised to them. Some in the US government feared that the Soviets would not be reliable in honoring an agreement, especially on the question of free elections in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, any agreement involving China still needed to be approved by Chiang Kai-shek. Truman expressed his view in his memoirs. "I was not willing to let Russia reap the fruits of a long, bitter, and valiant effort in which she had no part." The revisionists also suggest that, far from offering Japan an opportunity to surrender, the Potsdam Proclamation was deliberately designed to be unacceptable, thus justifying the use of the bombs. However, when the US dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, the revisionists argue that, rather than intimidating the Soviets, it spurred them on even more. Stalin knew of the bomb program thanks to his spies, but the test was a surprise. Apparently enraged, he moved the invasion date forward to August 9th. Thus, the orthodox argument that the bombs were dropped to save lives was questioned by the revisionists, who claimed the primary motivation was to prevent Soviet gains in Asia. A minority of revisionists even argued that the US dropped the bombs partly out of dark scientific curiosity or to justify the costs of developing them, but the evidence for this is weaker. Just one super important caveat. See if you agree. Pay attention. It is worth remembering how emotionally convenient the traditional explanation of Hiroshima is, both for Japan and for the United States. Ideas can persist because they are true, but unfortunately, they can also persist because they are emotionally satisfying. They fill an important psychic need. For example, at the end of the war, the traditional interpretation of Hiroshima helped Japan's leaders achieve a number of important political objectives, both domestic and international. Put yourself in the emperor's place. You have just led your country into a disastrous war. The economy is shaken. 80% of your cities have been bombed and set on fire. The army has suffered a series of defeats. The navy has been decimated and confined to port. Famine is approaching. The war, in short, was a catastrophe, and worst of all, you have been lying to your people about how bad the situation is. They will be shocked by the news of surrender. So, what do you prefer to do? Admit that you failed spectacularly? Issue a statement saying that you miscalculated in a spectacular way, made repeated mistakes, and caused enormous harm to the nation? Or do you prefer to blame the loss on an incredible scientific discovery that no one could have predicted? In a single stroke, blaming the atomic bomb for losing the war swept all the mistakes and errors of judgment of the war under the rug. The bomb was the perfect excuse for losing the war. There is no need to assign blame. No inquiry tribunal needs to be held. Japan's leaders could claim they did their best. Thus, on the most general level, one can also argue that the bomb served to deflect blame from Japan's leaders. But attributing Japan's defeat to the bomb also served three other specific political purposes. First, it helped preserve the legitimacy of the emperor. If the war was lost not because of mistakes, but because of the enemy's unexpected miraculous weapon, then the institution of the emperor could continue to find support within Japan. Second, it appealed to international sympathy. Japan waged an aggressive war, and with particular brutality against conquered peoples. Its behavior would likely be condemned by other nations. Being able to reframe Japan as a victimized nation, a nation that had been unjustly bombed with a cruel and horrifying instrument of war, would help offset some of the morally repugnant things the Japanese military had done. Drawing attention to the atomic bombings helped paint Japan in a more sympathetic light and divert support away from harsh punishments. Finally, saying that the bomb won the war would please the victorious Americans in Japan. The American occupation did not officially end in Japan until 1952, and during that time, the United States had the power to change or remake Japanese society as it saw fit. During the early days of the occupation, many Japanese officials feared that the Americans intended to abolish the institution of the emperor. And they had another concern. Many of Japan's top government officials knew they might face war crimes trials. The war crimes trials against Germany's leaders were already underway in Europe when Japan surrendered. Japanese historian Asada Sadao said that in many post-war interviews, Japanese officials were obviously anxious to please their American interrogators. If the Americans wanted to believe that the bomb won the war, attributing the end of the war to the atomic bomb served Japan's interests in several ways, but it also served U.S. interests. If the bomb had won the war, then the perception of U.S. military power would increase, U.S. diplomatic influence in Asia and worldwide would grow, and U.S. security would be strengthened. The $2 billion spent to build it would not have been wasted. If, on the other hand, Soviet entry into the war was what led Japan to surrender, then the Soviets could claim they had accomplished in 4 days what the United States had not in 4 years, and the perception of Soviet military power and Soviet diplomatic influence would be reinforced. And once the Cold War began, claiming that Soviet entry was the decisive factor would have been tantamount to aiding and comforting the enemy. It is troubling to consider, given the issues raised here, that the evidence of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lies at the heart of everything we think about nuclear weapons. This event is the foundation of the defense of the importance of nuclear arms. Crucial to their unique status is the notion that the normal rules do not apply to nuclear weapons. An important measure of nuclear threats is Truman's threat to unleash a reign of ruin on Japan, the first explicit nuclear threat. It is the key to the aura of enormous power that surrounds the weapons and makes them so important in international relations. That said, the orthodox and revisionist schools also disagree on another critical issue. Why exactly did Japan surrender? The Japanese people never knew that their country was losing the war. Even our capture of key points such as Saipan, Manila, and Okinawa was explained as a strategic withdrawal. Therefore, anyone in the upper echelons of government or the armed forces who recognized the symptoms of defeat found themselves in a cruel dilemma. Orthodox historians suggest that Japan would have continued fighting if it felt that its defensive plan to kill as many Allied troops as possible had a chance to succeed. However, the bombs weakened the Japanese belief that determined defense and Soviet mediation could end the war on more favorable terms. From this perspective, Japanese leaders came to accept that their country could be bombed into surrender, especially if the US planned to drop more atomic bombs after the first two, perhaps even on Tokyo. In reality, Truman planned to reduce the bombings after Nagasaki, and Tokyo was never targeted by an atomic bomb. But the Japanese did not know that. Their fears, according to Orthodox historians, were heightened by the shock of the atomic bombings, since Japanese scientists had theorized about them but were far from developing such weapons. Orthodox historians also claim that the Soviet attack was not as significant in Japan's decision to capitulate. Japanese leaders knew that a Soviet attack was possible, so its impact was minimal. In the Orthodox argument, the Soviet attack was worrisome for the Japanese, but did not pose a critical threat to the Japanese islands or to the Ketsugo Plan. In any case, Japan expected to lose Manchuria in a peace settlement. Therefore, the orthodox position is that Japan surrendered due to the destruction caused by the atomic bombs and the potential for more such attacks. The revisionist approach, however, sees this issue very differently. They suggest that the impact of the bombs has been exaggerated since the war, while the impact of the Soviet invasion has been minimized. First, the revisionists argue that the destruction caused by the atomic bombs was not so different from the impact of U.S. conventional bombings. In March 1945, a U.S. attack on Tokyo killed 84,000 people, more than the lower estimates for Hiroshima, and more than the immediate death toll in Nagasaki. In any case, most Japanese cities were already destroyed by the time atomic bombs were invented. Historian Robert Pipe put it this way: if we define the hostage as major and secondary cities with more than 100,000 people, then the hostage was practically dead before the atomic bombs fell. After the war, a U.S. strategic bombing survey estimated that the atomic bomb caused damage equivalent to 210 sorties of conventional bombers. In August 1945, the 21st Bomber Command was carrying out 1,200 sorties per week. In other words, it was as if they were dropping 5 atomic bombs per week on Japan. The revisionists claim that this reduced the shocking impact of the atomic bomb, since the Japanese leadership already expected mass death from conventional bombings or from an invasion. The Japanese military did not react strongly to the first atomic bombing and even doubted that an atomic weapon had been used. That is why they said they had more important matters to deal with than to attend the cabinet meeting on August 8th. According to the revisionists, the atomic bombings did not encourage surrender, but instead reinforced Japan's plan to defend its home islands and seek Soviet mediation. In fact, Japanese generals argued that atomic bombs would not be very useful during an invasion. The most important reason Japan abandoned its plan to fight to the end, according to the revisionists, was the Soviet Union's declaration of war. The atomic bombs caused confusion among Japanese leaders, but the Soviet attack was the realization of their worst-case scenario. When the Soviets declared war, all hopes of mediation through the USSR vanished. Although this was a foreseen scenario, the revisionists suggest that it resulted in an even greater shock than the bombs themselves. Within this context, we have the event known as the Kyujo Incident, which was a military coup attempt in the Japanese Empire that occurred on the night of August 14th to 15th, 1945, just hours before the announcement of Japan's surrender to the Allies at the end of World War II. The rebellious officers killed Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori and attempted to forge an order to occupy the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. They also tried to place the emperor under house arrest, but they failed to persuade the Eastern District Army or the command of the Imperial Japanese Army to proceed with the action. Because they were unable to convince the rest of the army to expel the Japanese imperial family, the rebels committed suicide. As a result, the announcement of Japan's surrender continued as planned. An example of evidence cited by the revisionists is the statement of General Kawabe, who was among those opposed to the coup d'etat. Since Tokyo was not directly affected by the bombing, the full force of the shock was not felt. In comparison, the Soviet entry into the war was a great shock when it actually happened. It caused us even greater shock and alarm, as we were constantly afraid that the vast forces of the Red Army in Europe were now turning against us. Tokyo was also concerned that Soviet involvement could trigger communist uprisings in Japan, which could end the imperial dynasty forever. The revisionists argue that this was what convinced even the military to accept the Potsdam Proclamation. For revisionist historians, the opinions of the military leaders of the Big Six are particularly important. They were the strongest faction within the cabinet and had previously vetoed peace attempts. But after the Soviet invasion, the revisionists say that even the military leaders decided to surrender, though still debating the exact terms of capitulation. Senior officers accepted Hirohito's sacred decision and did not launch a large-scale military coup. The revisionists also claimed that Hirohito was not motivated to save civilian lives, since he did nothing to prevent the deaths caused by conventional strategic bombings, and that his true priority was to save the imperial privileges of his family and the sanctuaries from invasion or communist revolution. Therefore, orthodox thinking is that the bombs forced Japan to surrender, while the revisionists argue that it was Soviet intervention. All these discussions have led historians to wonder whether the US could have forced Japan to surrender in a different way without the use of the bombs. One of the most debated what-ifs is the idea that Japan would likely have surrendered before a US invasion occurred. The revisionists raised the possibility that if the Allies had guaranteed the emperor's position in the Potsdam Proclamation, the Japanese would have surrendered earlier. The revisionists also raise other possibilities that could have led to Japan's surrender instead of the bombs, such as maintaining the naval blockade or conventional bombings. It has been argued that the maritime blockade, which was practically complete by mid-August, would have strangled Japan's economy, and that the B-29 bombers and naval artillery ships would have destroyed its major cities and forced a surrender in a short time without the aid of atomic bombs or invasion. Some even believe that a Soviet invasion of the island of Hokkaido would also have immediately ended the war. As you can imagine, Orthodox historians have vigorously criticized these points. They claim that if the US had guaranteed the emperor's position, the Japanese might have interpreted it as a sign of weakness and continued fighting. Important figures in the Japanese government gave no indication that they would consider surrender before August, despite the devastating effects of strategic bombings and the blockade. Orthodox arguments also point to the high death tolls that more strategic bombings, starvation from the blockade, or a Soviet invasion would have caused, perhaps taking more lives than the bombs did, even without a US invasion, including among the peoples under Japanese occupation. An additional argument is that the bombs actually gave Japan a justification to surrender. One last note about Japan's military capability at the end of the war, since I see many people on the internet making comments without any real basis. It is simply not true that Japan no longer had military capability by mid-August. Although 2,550 kamikaze aircraft had already been used, 5,350 still remained, along with many others ready for orthodox use and about 7,000 under repair or in storage. And 5,000 young men were training for the Kamikaze Corps. Japan's plan was to disperse all aircraft across small grass airstrips in Kyushu, Shikoku, and western Honshu, as well as in underground hangars and caves, to preserve them and use them in kamikaze attacks against the Allied forces invading the main islands. Considering the number of planes, pilots, and potential targets, all located within a short distance of the main airfields, one can imagine the terrible losses the invading forces would have suffered even before reaching the Japanese coast. Had the Allied landings occurred, they would have resulted in prolonged battles on Japanese soil, with significant losses on both sides and bitterness that would have persisted even after the war's end. Japan still possessed a large amount of ammunition, as thousands of tons were found by the U.S. Army in Hokkaido alone after the conflict. Whether it was right or wrong to drop the nuclear bombs on Japan is impossible to say with exact certainty, black and white, due to the thousands of variables involved in the case. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.